So we're keeping up. So we're week number 7 now. So we're over halfway through, and we're continuing the conversation that we started last week. So last week we started a conversation about Jesus. We're going to keep going with that conversation. Today is going to mostly focus on the resurrection. So and the various evidences for that. Because that's just an area of challenge for a lot of people. They will question the resurrection, and we're going to skip over this again. If we have time, we can always come back to review from last week. But let's just kind of get started with what are the historical facts of the resurrection? Anyone have any idea as to like what kind of evidence we actually might have for the actual resurrection of Jesus? And it's okay if you don't know, because that's kind of the point of this class. But
well, we know pretty much the time that he existed just from other accounts,
right?
Extra biblical accounts and gospel accounts of different people within like a generation of him existing.
Right.
So yeah.
Were you in last week's class? Were you
No.
there? Oh, okay. So that's pretty cool.
I did just listen to a podcast. It's funny that we're talking about it. I did just listen to a podcast that Sean McDowell was on.
Yep.
So he actually covered a lot of this stuff.
He did.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello there, Ryan. Hey, Carolyn. Wow. Okay, this is turning into a big class.
It was just me feeding for
Yeah, I was getting a little worried. So here, this slide doesn't actually have the evidence yet, but so the truth of the resurrection will come as a matter of conviction through the Holy Spirit, right? So that's how you really know. But it doesn't mean that we can't know through our head too, through our intellect. And there is significant historical evidence for it. And so like Kelly was saying, we do have accounts, right? So we have accounts of the crucifixion, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. Actually, let's just kind of move right to it. The minimal facts approach.
Sorry, I skipped you.
No, that's okay. Because actually, let's just kind of say so. This is the minimal facts approach was developed by two guys, primarily one. So his name is Gary Habermas. He's the leading authority pretty much in the world on the resurrection. He's been studying it since about in the mid-70s is when he started that. But he did it in tandem with another author. Come on in, Becca.
Yeah, just making sure we're in the right place.
Yep, you're in the right spot. And there's donuts here. I don't bite, so feel free to come and get one. So yes. So yeah, he and Habermas and Lycona developed this minimal facts approach, and the point is to use data that's attested to by nearly all historical scholars across the worldview spectrum. So atheists, polytheists, Christians, runs the gamut. And these are the 4 facts. There's actually really 5, but there's 4 that are attested to by almost all of them. And there's the 5th one is like most of them, but not to the same degree as the other 4. So these are the 4 facts of the resurrection, which is that 1, that Jesus died by crucifixion. The second is that the disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them. Okay. Then the third one is that Paul, the persecutor, was changed, right? So he was converted. And then the 4th one is that James, the skeptic brother of Jesus, was also changed. The 5th one is that there was an empty tomb. Okay. That is less well attested to, although it is, like I said, it's still the majority of historical scholars believe that or attest to that. But these are the 4 that is almost unanimous. So the first one, so being that Jesus died by crucifixion, so that goes back to Kelly's point, right? So Kelly was saying that there's certain authors, right, and so ancient historians, mainly in this case Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian of Samosata, sounds like Japanese. I don't think he was Japanese. And the Jewish Talmud. Okay, so those 4 in particular strongly attest to the actual crucifixion and death of Jesus. That's important, not just the crucifixion. You'll see why that distinction is important in just a little bit. But it means that Jesus did not revive after being taken off the cross. Okay, and that's an important detail for some of these challenges that are then brought up against Christianity concerning the resurrection. The second one, Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them. So really what you get from this is that the disciples couldn't be lying about their belief that he was resurrected or that they saw him. And the reason why they believe this is because the disciples first said that they saw Jesus, right? So they said that. And the second is that was then confirmed by their complete transformation afterwards. So if anyone remembers, I think we might have been discussing this last week, how they kind of go from these kind of cowering individuals that, even the thought of being, arrested, they flee and they don't defend Jesus at all. So they go from these like very kind of afraid beings to powerful proclaimers of the gospel, being bold, standing up to the Sanhedrin, and then all of them eventually being martyred for their faith, or what they believe to be true. So there's this obvious transformation that happens, and something would have had to have happened in order for that to occur. And they say it was because it was the resurrection. So they genuinely believe that they saw something. And that's, again, across the board, atheist historians as well as Christian historians attest to that. So it's an important one. And then 3, Paul the persecutor was changed. So in this case, you have someone who was actively persecuting Christians, hated Christians, that then went to being their strongest advocate, right? So he also died for his faith, or for his conviction that Jesus was the Son of God, and so something must have motivated him to do that. And then lastly, we have James, the skeptic, brother of Jesus, was also changed. So I don't know if you guys know, but James, there's actually a part in the book of Mark where it talks about Jesus' family and how they kind of weren't that complimentary of him. In Mark 3:21, it says Jesus' family said that he was out of his mind, right, for the things that he was saying. They weren't. Now I don't know about Mary, because this was revealed to Mary at his birth, but certainly his brothers did not at that time believe that he was who he said he was. But then we have an account from 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul actually writes that I'm losing my train of thought, that Jesus appeared to James. So and then it's that kind of acts as that transformative agent that then changes him, because we know that James then becomes the leader of the church and is also martyred for what he proclaimed about Jesus. So those are the 4 facts, and we're going to see how those 4 facts really make a good case that the resurrection actually happened, especially in light of a lot of the challenges that are brought up against Christianity. Does anyone have any questions about those 4 facts before we move on to some of the challenges? Or anyone familiar with these facts? Is that okay? So some people are. Okay, very good. So how do skeptics explain the facts? So we have. Since the 4 facts are considered historical, they do require an explanation, right? So if you're going to say that one of these facts are false, you're going against, historical scholarship. So, we kind of have to go with what the historical scholarship is saying, and can we rationalize an explanation, a natural explanation? That's what they try to do. So they try to say, well, you don't necessarily need a supernatural resurrection in order to have these 4 historical facts. There could be alternative explanations, and that's what we're going to look at. So what are these these main theories used to challenge a supernatural resurrection, and do they account for the basic historical facts, or do they create contradictions? Do they account for one but not the other 3? Do they account for 3 but not 1? You want to see if they synthesize all 4 facts at the same time in a powerful way. So here's the first one. Does anyone see a problem with that before I even put up any other bullet points? Jesus only appeared to die. There's that, right? So, yeah. There's kind of a lack of knowledge, maybe, about the crucifixion process itself. Think of the 4 points.
That's a lot of special effects they do.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
Right.
But your statement earlier was that the historical facts say that he did die.
Correct.
And this is a new book from the get-go.
Exactly. So yeah, because in order to even say this, you're already going against historical scholarship. So, but you will have, some people will say that there's a swoon theory. Oh, you're here.
You don't need to do communion.
I can walk and shoot on.
Okay, sure.
Well, just in time for the swoon theory. So.
Oh, okay, good.
There you go. Yes. So Jesus only appeared to die, and like Carolyn said, that goes against fact number 1 right off the bat. But we're going to entertain it for just a second. Is this even plausible? So, like I said, it conflicts with fact number 1. So if Jesus survived the cross, the disciples would have assumed that he was dying. So let's just do a little thought experiment. Pretend that I'm going to do my best with this. You're outside your house. You witness a car accident, okay, and it's a bad one, right? So where the person didn't look good. And so you kind of run to your home, call 911, and you're like waiting for them to show up. And then you go outside and you realize that the person is crawling up your driveway, but you thought for sure that they were probably dead. What are you going to assume in that moment? Are you going to assume that they were resurrected? I think is my question. No, you're going to assume what? They're just mostly dead, and they happen to. Right, they survived it. And so in the case of the resurrection, if you had seen, if Jesus presented himself to these people and he happened to survive crucifixion, what do you think he would look like? Pretty bad. So it would look something akin to that. When we think about the crucifixion process, well, what was the first thing that happened in the crucifixion process? Do you remember, like that before he was actually crucified? Scourging, right? So he was shredded. I mean, his capillaries, his veins were kind of dangling off of him. His organs were in view. His back was, I'm sure, just completely destroyed. I think Isaiah even says about the Messiah that he was unrecognizable. So he would have been in really bad shape. Not to mention the crucifixion process is going to sever his median nerves. So his hands are unusable. He can't use those. So he's going to be like crawling in this, extremely, wrecked state. And so they're not going to assume that they're witnessing the resurrected Christ. They're going to assume that they're witnessing a dying man. So that's kind of another, I think, valid point to bring up on that. And then, like Katie said, it's virtually impossible to survive crucifixion at all. So things that we know about the... Were you going to say something, Carolyn?
Is there any historical record anywhere of anyone actually ever surviving crucifixion?
No.
I'm sure they knew what they were doing. This was the punishment of the time. They wouldn't have a,
But that's why this is dumb, though. Like, no
Yeah.
one's ever
Yeah. That's why a lot of people have walked away from this theory because it's ridiculous. But
I really feel like if they were going to make any person of the time, if they were going to make sure that somebody was really dead, they would make sure that Christ was dead.
yeah. And
I don't think they're going to skimp on that. Oh, yeah, it's fine.
and actually in the accounts we have that happen. So
When they do that, when they pierce the side,
Yeah.
so what happened? What happened when they did that? Anyone remember? Blood and water. Do you know what that shows?
it just means that your lungs were full of water.
Lungs, even the pericardial sac around your heart could have water in it. Really, what they think is going on is that they pierced his heart. And of course, can you survive that? No. You're dead. So there's no way. And the Journal of AMA in 1986 wrote this about it: interpretations that Jesus did not die on the cross appear at odds with modern medical knowledge. So we have an authoritative source kind of confirming that in modern times. And then it's just additionally Roman soldiers. If they took someone off the cross and that person was not dead, they themselves would be executed. Right. So there was a high motivation for the Roman soldiers to make sure that person was dead. And like Ryan said.
Wasn't that the breaking of the knees too?
Mm-hmm.
If it was taking too long, they would just break the knees, and then they couldn't support themselves to breathe anymore.
Right.
And then you were done in that.
Yeah. Well, because I think that's suffocation is really what ultimately kills you with crucifixion.
Because does it say somewhere where his body wasn't broken?
Mm-hmm. Bones.
So they didn't break his bones.
Right.
Puncture his
Heart or lungs or yeah. So which either way, puncture the heart or the lungs, it's fatal. So yeah. So yes, the bottom line is that even by today's modern standards, it's not possible to survive what the accounts say about Jesus' crucifixion or what we know about crucifixion in general. So
Even if you would say he survived this heart lung piercing was brought down, it's like there's no fixing that at that time.
yeah.
You're not going to take him to Hiroshima and be like, this is
Yeah, right. All right, so that's the first one. It's one of the more preposterous ones. And then we have the disciples stole the body. Any thoughts on this one before we get into what I have from the book? Thoughts about how this might maybe conflict with some of the four facts that we have. That's what we're always trying to compare it to.
Changed men don't come from stolen bodies.
That's pretty much the bottom line with that one. Yes. So the problem with this one is that this forces the disciples to now believe their own lie. Okay, because the second fact is that the disciples believed that they saw the resurrected Jesus. So you can't believe that you saw the resurrected Jesus and steal his body at the same time. right? So if you stole his body, first of all, you don't get a resurrected Jesus from that. You only get an empty tomb from that. So you're hinging your entire argument on the fact that everyone's going to believe that Jesus resurrected himself, or Jesus was resurrected, because there was no one in the tomb. But that's not what the disciples claim. The disciples and Paul also claim that they saw Jesus, right? So this is that kind of goes pretty strongly against fact number 2. It also doesn't explain Paul or James, right? So if Jesus' body just disappeared, is that going to convince Paul, a persecutor of the church, that Christianity is true? It wouldn't, because he's probably going to go along with the Pharisees. They're all going to say, well, the disciples stole the body. However, if he actually witnessed, Jesus, if he saw the resurrected Jesus, which is what he said he did, then that could be enough to transform him. I'm trying to see if there's any other. So some people will claim that that other religious fanatics. So this is kind of coming back to. Can you die for a lie? Okay, so in the case of the disciples, they all were willing to be martyred for their faith, right? We know this. The only one, John, was the only one that wasn't necessarily martyred, but the rest of them were. And so, can you die for a lie? That's the question. And so some people will cite something like the 9/11 terrorists, right? Which they were willing to die for Allah, right? And they'll try to compare the disciples to them. Anyone see why that's a slightly different category?
They believe that Allah is true.
Mm-hmm.
So while we know it's a lie, they don't think it's a lie.
Right, but so why would the apostles not be able? Why wouldn't they be able to do that in the same way as the Islamic terrorists?
Islamic terrorists had the unfortunately dying instantly.
Okay.
The men and the apostles did not die instantly.
It was a more gruesome death. Right. Yeah, and that's true. So that's and that is why it's so compelling. I think just because of how they died, that is definitely. I mean, you think of like Peter being crucified upside down. Many of one of them I think was flayed to death. Like they're really gruesome deaths. But really, I think what makes this kind of categorically different than them is the fact that the apostles would have known it was a lie. The Islamic terrorists wouldn't have necessarily. They can believe with all their heart that Allah is true and real and good. But if the apostles stole the body, they can't believe that. That's impossible. You can't believe your own lie. And so for them to die for it, they'd have to die for something that they knew was false. Whereas the Islamic terrorists don't necessarily know that. This is like their belief kind of leaves it for them to think that it's actually true. So, but when you compound it with like what Carolyn said, with the intensity of their deaths, it makes it even more unlikely. So.
If I can add to that. Yeah, there's two different ways, and I think you kind of alluded to this or started to get into this. There's two different ways that people have tried to use this. One, either that the disciples stole the body, or that someone else stole the body. There you go. I'll let you handle this from here.
Now there might be I don't have a ton of details for this one, but if there's something else that you want to add, please do. So, because really what you run into a lot of the same issues with this theory as you do with the other one. So it doesn't explain why the disciples, James and Paul, all saw something, right? So if the only thing that it really does explain is it leaves the potential for the disciples. What's that? I think he's telling you to be quiet. It's so funny. I made these slides like months ago, and so I'm desensitized to them now. Like I've just seen this guy with the shopping cart for like the past 4 months, and so I'm just used to it. But
like you're gonna run into a supermarket and manage to get all of that, looking inconspicuous, like a Hamas terrorist.
Oh boy. Yeah,
He just holds up his Costco membership card. There's no bags anywhere, just one.
Oh, that's funny.
They're already throwing you off.
No, you're good. I'll get on that train again. Okay, so it runs in the same problems that the previous theory does. The only thing that it allows for is it allows for the disciples to believe that maybe they saw Jesus and it was something like a hallucination. Okay, because if the disciples stole the body, then they were actively participating in their own concocted lie. Whereas now they're more passive, And so it does allow for them to be deceived in some way. Still, you run into a lot of trouble with Paul, though, because Paul is not hinging his argument on the fact that he saw an empty tomb. He's hinging it on the fact that he saw the resurrected Christ. So there's that. Is there anything else I want to add to that? Yeah, only comes with it. Did you want to add something to that, Paul?
Nope, good enough.
Okay, good enough? Okay. So, again, this is kind of still suffering from the same problem. So witnesses went to the wrong tomb, but this is another thing that people will say, is that they went to the wrong tomb, and because they went to the wrong tomb, it was empty, and they think that it was...
There were so many of these tombs laying around.
It's like going to visit somebody at a gravesite, and you're like, oops, that was the wrong one. My grandma, but it was the wrong one.
Especially if it was Jesus of all people.
Right.
I mean, they knew.
With Lawrence out front.
Yeah. I mean, Joseph of Arimathea is going to know, which grave was his that I'm sure was being hewn over the past decade. I mean, you can't just hew a grave or a tomb overnight. And it fails. This again, it only accounts for the empty tomb. It doesn't account for why they believe they saw Jesus. So same issue with Paul. Same issue with James, actually, by the way, because James would have wanted more evidence than simply an empty tomb, even if he was Jesus' brother, because I'm sure that was traumatic for him to know that his brother died in the most gruesome way imaginable. But he's still going to want more evidence than an empty tomb. So. Anything else? Oh, this is also it. So authorities would have pointed to the correct tomb to stop the rumors, right? So if you're having a riot that's going to start out and all these theories flying around that Jesus raised from the dead, and that it was because they went to the wrong tomb, well, you're going to go exhume the body and show, nope, he's not dead, which they never did. So there's no account of them finding a body, either the government or the Pharisees or the Sanhedrin. So by all accounts, the body. I mean, we know where the body went, but they don't.
There's one more to add to that is that I think it's fun that the Gospels add that not only did one set of people go to the tomb, but whenever they heard that the tomb was empty, another set ran. So you're actually saying that they doubled the number of people would have had to go to the wrong tomb.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so as weird as this is the fact that potentially covers, this is the theory that potentially covers the most facts, as strange as it sounds. So they were all hallucinating, okay? So people sometimes hallucinate when they're grief-stricken, okay? So you can imagine definitely the disciples, but arguably even James, as his brother, might have been grief-stricken after the crucifixion, and there have been accounts of people having hallucinations when they're grief-stricken. Anybody have any ideas as to why, what some problems with this theory might be?
That they're all hallucinating at the exact same time, the exact same thing.
Right.
All doing the exact same way.
So that kind of goes against what? Just kind of comments.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, what was your question?
Yeah, so why is that so preposterous?
Well, I mean, the way that I'm going to grieve is going to be different than anybody else in this room.
Right.
So I feel like it's not plausible in itself, because we know nowadays that if you lose a loved one, there's all those different stages of grief, and everybody's going to deal with it in a different way.
Right.
So I feel like that's not even plausible to say that they're all going to hallucinate at the exact same time with the same person.
Correct. Yeah.
Seeing the exact same thing. If they said they were hallucinating, one person saw him and another person was hallucinating and said, oh, well, I didn't see the grave, I didn't see the body, I don't know. They're all seeing the exact same thing at the exact same time.
It goes against all of our experience, right? I mean, most of us, when you get to a certain age of life, have experienced loss of a loved one at some point, and most of us don't hallucinate. And so, yeah, so like Becca was saying, it's extremely unlikely that one, let alone two or three or all of them, all hallucinated the same thing, right? And that goes against everything that we know about psychology. People don't mass hallucinate. And when we look at the facts about what we know about who saw him, I mean, 1 Corinthians 15 says that that Jesus appeared to Cephas, right? So to Peter, and then to the 12. So kind of unsure as to who those 12 what might be, because obviously Judas Iscariot wasn't there, and Cephas is already in there. So Peter's. Do we know like who the 12 is referring to in that?
Sorry, what reference?
This is 1 Corinthians 15:5. So and then Jesus appeared to Cephas, meaning Peter, and then to the 12, and after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters. Yeah, because I think the assumption is the 12 disciples, but Judas is dead and Matthias is not.
He's one of them, so why would he? Yeah, okay. No, but then he could be included in the original 12 students, and yeah.
It's just kind of an interesting, but he appeared to the 12, whoever the 12 are, Peter, and then 500 other brothers and sisters, like believers in Jesus, at the same time. So we're now forced to argue that 500 people all saw Jesus, a hallucination of Jesus at the same time, which is, again, like Beck was saying, it's just completely implausible. It doesn't happen. So, hallucinations exist in the mind of one person, not many, not two, not 500. And then even more than that, simultaneous group hallucinations are highly improbable. And then Paul is really the nail in the coffin. I mean, he has no reason to have a hallucination, right? Paul is a persecutor of the church. He has no motivation to see Jesus out of grief. You would have to start arguing that he had some other mental condition like schizophrenia, which again, there's a lot more assumptions that you're adding on to here that make it less and less and less likely. So, this is a fun one. So Christianity is based on a myth. So we kind of tackled this question last week, but let's bring it up again because this is just an interesting one. So why don't you read that? And actually, we can just go through it. So the god of Mithra was born of a virgin on December 25th, had 12 disciples, performed miracles, was buried in a tomb, and rose after 3 days, had followers who celebrated his resurrection annually, and was called the way, the truth, and the light. And I always think that last one's kind of weird because Jesus didn't say that. He said the life. But anyway, that's what it said in the book. So if you kind of saw this, you were on Facebook and you're scrolling on the internet and someone says, Christianity debunked, look at these facts. Mithra, had all these, common traits as Jesus. What are you thinking at that point?
I've never heard of this song. Where's this coming from?
Okay, good. That's what I want you. Yeah. So you want before you like kind of have a crisis of faith, look it up because you're gonna people are constantly posting stuff about Osiris and they're connecting Osiris's life to the resurrection and there's no basis for it or it's too loose to be considered relevant in any way. And so let's just kind of dive through. So Mithras or Mithra. I should have written Mithras because Mithras is actually kind of like a reworking of a Persian god Mithra. They have a lot of similarities, but Mithras is the Roman version of Mithra, and Mithras is the one that people usually compare Jesus to. And so Mithras was born from a rock, not a virgin. So unless you're getting really super abstract, I think saying a rock is a virgin is kind of weird. So that's not really a commonality between the two. The December 25th date, however, is. So Mithras was. Well, actually, we don't know that he was born on December 25th. He was celebrated on December 25th, which is when we celebrate Jesus. The thing with Jesus is that so Jesus was not born on December 25th. Right, but we do celebrate his birthday on December 25th, and that was kind of a way for once Christian culture became kind of the predominating culture, it was a way to kind of insert Christian holidays and rituals into the previously pagan holidays and rituals, and it was a way for them to kind of easily accept Christianity instead of trying to impose like another holiday for Jesus. They kind of, we're going to celebrate it on your previous holiday, which was usually dedicated to Mithras. And so that's kind of the history there. Did you have something you wanted to add to that, Paul?
Which part?
The December 25th thing with Mithras and Jesus and kind of the origin of why we celebrate December 25th.
There's a couple different reasons I'm thinking about. Pastor Russ has one. I have one from medieval history. Particularly, this is kind of interesting. It's basically Jewish mysticism, mystic fact that begins to say around the time of the intertestamental period which is after, maybe more specific here, after Malachi, but before Matthew.
Okay.
That time period right there, they began to come up with the idea that March 25th was the beginning of the world. That is actually celebrated as New Year's Day for most of the medieval world, and it was one of the original traditional dates of Easter.
March 25th.
There's a lot to do with March 25th.
Okay.
Count 9 months from March 25th.
You get December 25th.
And you get December 25th, and with such perfection right there, which also happens to do, you have a Trinitarian March number along with 5 squared. They have a lot of numerology and a lot of apocalyptic kind of things going on, which fits the time period as well.
Okay.
So that's one. Pastor Ross has a completely different explanation for where they came from. So part of it is we don't exactly know. I've also heard, and I think that there's probably something to this, that there was a monk who did his math wrong.
Oh.
That is actually legitimately what is often cited.
Okay. I just wasn't sure because if you knew something more than I did, which I didn't know any of that, so you did. But very good. So that's the December 25th date. Bottom line is that that's not when Jesus was born, and to say that that's a connection between him and Mithras is just false from the get-go for that reason alone. Really, you're just looking at we happen to celebrate those days, those two events on the same day. So had 12 disciples. Mithras didn't have 12 disciples. So that's a pretty it's just wrong. So then perform miracles. That's not really a convincing connection because anyone that was proposing that they had a god or that someone had godlike powers is going to have the ability to perform supernatural feats. So just saying that Mithras performed miracles and so did Jesus, that's not really a connection. Any god, Krishna, they all perform miracles of some kind. The question is whether or not they actually perform miracles, whether or not they were real. So then number, 5, was buried in a tomb and rose after 3 days. We have no account of Mithras even dying. So you can't, be buried in a tomb if you're not dead. Had followers who celebrated his resurrection annually. Well, you can't be resurrected if you never died. And then finally, that last one was called The Way, the Truth, and the Light. There's no historical evidence of that at all. So he was pretty much just manufactured out of whole cloth, basically. And the only two connections are the fact that he performed miracles, which of course any god would be able to do, and then December 25th, which, like I said, just it was just a common festival day, which really aligned with the winter solstice, more or less than anything. So it's not they're not really strong connections. Just to continue that, there's other people, there's other personages or myths that they will compare Jesus to, which are also unfounded. So the reason I think that's Osiris right there. So Osiris, his origin story is that he was murdered and then he had his body parts scattered. So I guess he was dismembered. And of course, the only connection there is that, Jesus died, right? He was murdered in a manner of speaking, and then, of course, then deviates because Jesus was not dismembered and then put back together. And then the whole end of it was that Osiris could then become god of the underworld, right? So some of you are familiar with that story, which of course very much deviates from Jesus' story, right? So Jesus did not become Lord of the underworld; he became Lord over all, particularly life, right? He is the way that we get eternal life. So it's actually the opposite. He's not the Lord of the dead, but of the living. So, and even if the parallel claims were true, so I love this. This is probably my favorite part of today's presentation. So, okay, so let's just go back to Mithras for a second, and let's just pretend all of those details are true. That Mithras was born of a virgin. Let's even say her name was Mary. On December 25th, had 12 disciples, performed miracles, was buried in a tomb, had followers, who celebrated his resurrection, was called the way, the truth, and the light. Let's even pretend it said life. If that happened, right? So if there was an account that predated Jesus, which actually most of the source documentation for Mithras postdates Jesus, so making it so that it would actually the information would have been taken from Jesus, not from Mithras. But let's just pretend that it was before Jesus. Does that mean that Jesus didn't do all those things? Yeah, it would just mean that you had an account that lined up very coincidentally with the life of Jesus, right? That's what that would mean. Now, it looks suspicious, right? But let's take a moment with. I'm gonna read something to you. So there was a book called Futility, written by Morgan Robertson in 1898. And so I'm just going to read you what the synopsis of this story is. It's the story of an ocean liner called the Titan, which sinks in the North Atlantic Ocean after hitting an iceberg. What does that sound like? The Titanic.
When was it written?
1898.
Whoa. That's
Whoa.
creepy.
Isn't that weird? Do you what's the name of the boat even? Titan.
Wow.
Like it's 2 letters off. So yeah, but it's a fictional book. Now, does the existence of that book mean that the Titanic didn't actually sink? No. So that's kind of like the point that I'm trying to make, is that even if all those things about Mithras were true, it still doesn't mean that Jesus didn't do all the things that it said that he did, right? So it's kind of a crazy thing. But so that's, like I said, that's my little that's my little fun fact of the day. So you can fact check me on it too. Futility was the name of the book by Morgan Robertson. So the Gospels were embellished. This kind of goes a little bit hand in hand with the last one. So the claim is that as time went on, supernatural details were inserted into the Gospel accounts. How much time do I have? 15 minutes. Okay. And the way that they get this is they'll say, well, there's a 20-year gap in between the death and resurrection of Jesus and the first accounts that we have. Now, there's some debate as to whether that it's a firm 20 years. Some people will say it's more like 15 to 20, somewhere in there, that the first accounts are written. But given that 15 to 20-year window, they'll say that, well, there's time for it to develop into folklore and legend. I would say that that's too short, right? Because anyone know why that would be a little too short for legend and folklore to develop?
I mean, like, they're still writing it in their lifetime. It's not like they told descendants of themselves and then they wrote it.
That's
Right.
like 9/11 being folklore.
Yes, that's exactly right. So,
We all lived that.
right, we were all, yeah, I guess everyone in this room was there, so we all can remember that, and so we all have first-hand accounts. You would have to get to next generations, and it would pretty much have to be after whatever generation existed during that time was already dead. Yeah, in order to have that kind of folklore to develop. So we're talking 60, 70, 80 years after is when you can start to have that effect manifest. But there's actually pretty good evidence that we have an earliest creed that dates between 4 to 6 years after Jesus' death, which is found in 1 Corinthians 15. I feel like 1 Corinthians 15 just has everything in today's presentation, which is from here. So this is Paul's writing, and he's saying, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Okay, so Paul received this. He's not saying that he's not writing this. He's saying that he received this from someone else, which is that Christ died for our sins, was buried, and was raised on the 3rd day. Okay, so when people are saying that the Gospels were embellished, what are they usually saying? Actually, yeah, what does it say that they're embellished with? What kind of details? Miracles, right? Right, yeah, so miracles, supernatural details, right? That would not normally happen. So in this creed right here, it says that Christ died for our sins, was buried, and was raised on the 3rd day. Is there a miracle in there?
Yes.
Which one?
Raised from the dead.
Raised from the dead, right? So that's that, and that's really the crux of our faith, right? If we don't have a risen Jesus, we don't really have a faith. And so we have the most important miracle to our faith being written down possibly around 4 to 6 years after Jesus' death. And the way that we get that 4 to 6 years is we look to Galatians 1:18, which again is Paul's writing. And he says, then after 3 years, this is 3 years after he had his Damascus experience, I went to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, meaning Peter, and stayed with him for 15 days. So he stayed with Peter around 3 years after he had his road to Damascus experience, and that's thought to be when he would have received this creed, right? Because obviously Jesus first-hand account, so he would have had every reason to express this creed to him, and that's where we get that, because we know approximately 1 to what would that be? 1 to 3 years after Jesus' death was when he had his road to Damascus experience, and then we know it was 3 years after that. That's how you get the 6 years. That's how you get that end date, that 6-year date to when he would have received this from Peter. So that's kind of why we believe that this creed actually goes back that far. So here we have it's really just within a few years after Jesus died that we already have them affirming the resurrection was a reality. So any questions on that? Does that make sense? Cool. All right. So why do Christians believe a resurrection is the best explanation? So really none of those theories. So we just kind of went into each theory. We didn't really go into kind of how well they account for everything. But why do we think that the supernatural resurrection is actually the one that accounts best for those four facts, right? Because when we go back to each one of those challenges, there's almost always at least one thing that they're leaving out. The only one that kind of gets all of them is the hallucination thing, right? And as we said, there's that has some serious problems. So let's kind of go into it a little bit. So evaluating the resurrection as a historical hypothesis. So this is Michael Licona's. He developed these four key criteria to weigh hypotheses and develop and to in order to give them credence. So 1 is explanatory scope, 2 is explanatory power, 3 is plausibility, and 4 is less ad hoc. So those are just very academic terms that mean things that are fairly simple. They're not as fancy as they sound. So let's kind of just go into what each one is really talking about. So explanatory scope is the hypothesis that accounts for the most facts, right? So I have like a whole library of books there because it's the one that at least explains to some degree each fact. Right, so in the case of, so we have the first four, so the four facts are that Jesus died by crucifixion, that the disciples believed that they saw the risen Jesus, that Paul the persecutor was changed, and that Jesus, the skeptic brother of Jesus, was also changed, right? So when we look at the facts, which ones actually explain all of them, okay? And like I said, the only one that really can kind of do that is hallucination, right? Because hallucination allows for Jesus to be dead, right? He doesn't have to be alive anymore because, in the case of the swoon theory, Jesus has to be alive, right, in order for that to play out. It also allows for them to be deceived, right, because if they're hallucinating something, then they could have been deceived by whatever they hallucinated. Again, this is where it starts to break down, but Paul, again, if he has schizophrenia or something, might have also hallucinated, and then James might have also hallucinated because it was his brother that died. So that's really the only one that has explanatory scope because it actually attempts to it somewhat explains all four facts in some way. But a supernatural resurrection is much more powerful, and so we're going to kind of talk about what that means. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory. The supernatural resurrection does explain those four facts, and explains them very effectively. And so we're going to talk about explanatory power, which hinges around how well a hypothesis explains the facts. Okay, so let's just kind of take the Jesus surviving, crucifixion example. So that can explain what the disciples saw, but it doesn't explain what they saw very well, right? Because if they saw Jesus after he somehow survived crucifixion, what are they going to assume? Which is what? That he's dying, right? He's in the process of dying. That he hasn't actually been resurrected. But when we take it into the hallucination, so like I said, the hallucination hypothesis does give some explanation for each four, but this is where it really fails, right? Because it has very little explanatory power. Because why would a persecutor of the church, have a hallucination, right? You're going to have to start arguing that he had a mental condition. Why would James, do that? Why would there be multiple hallucinations? Again, there's just so many things that are making this implausible that really doesn't make it a powerful explanation, even though it has some scope. Does that make sense? I kind of follow that? Okay. So let's see if there's anything else. Yep, kind of said that already. Plausibility. So this is how well a hypothesis accounts for a variety of accepted truths. So accepted truths can be anything from, what goes up must come down. If you touch a fire, you're going to burn yourself. If you stand in front of a car, it's going to hit you. There's all sorts of accepted truths that we have to account for. And which one kind of doesn't have to go beyond the accepted truths or deny some of them. It's difficult to evaluate the resurrection because there's no consensus about God's existence. So that's not really an accepted truth. There's debate on that. It's not something that we have complete evidence for. We give our evidence, right? Those three, the moral argument, the cosmological argument, and teleological, the design argument. We feel gives pretty good evidence that God exists. But people give other evidence or lack of evidence. Really, they just say, well, we've never seen God or something. So there's no consensus on this, which makes it difficult for us to use that particular criterion as an accepted truth. But even if we were to accept that God did exist, does that mean that all, supernatural or miraculous claims are plausible? So if God exists, it could say hypothetically, my coworker Jim said that he saw a flock of flying pigs going over his car on his way to work over Route 501 2 days ago. Is that plausible to you? Why?
Never seen that before happen.
Right.
Makes sense.
I think that's a way. So that's kind of a way of saying there's no context for it, right? So there's no reason to believe that. It's just kind of thin air. Someone's claiming that they saw flying pigs go over their car, and so. But when there's context, it's what gives miracles their power. So in the case of Jesus, why do we believe that it's plausible to say that Jesus rose from the dead? Because he's God, right? And he demonstrated that, right? So through his miracles, he claimed his divinity. He also predicted that he was going to rise from the dead. And so there's a lot of historical context to say that is actually much more plausible because he said all these things. So in the case of the resurrection, these are kind of it's going to make more sense when I go into less ad hoc. So when we think of the accepted truths surrounding the resurrection. So crucifixion causes death, right? So that's an accepted truth. We have that one. People don't mass hallucinate, right? That's generally another accepted truth. We have liars can't believe their own lie, right? That's another truth. Persecutors don't convert without a good reason, all right? So we have kind of four accepted truths there that we're then going to use. So let's go into less ad hoc. So less ad hoc is relying on fewer assumptions that go beyond the evidence. And there's kind of there's a relationship going on between less ad hoc and plausibility. Essentially, the more plausibility you have, the less ad hoc you have. So what that means is that if you have a bunch of accepted truths that are making and your claim correlates with those accepted truths, well, you're not relying on assumptions anymore. You're just kind of aligning with the truths. Once you start to increase in your assumptions, well, now you're kind of having to deny some of those truths, and your plausibility goes down. Does that kind of make sense? It's kind of a seesaw effect going on between these two criterion. Okay, so let's kind of return to the example of Jesus, right? And the accepted truth. So we have the crucifixion causes death. People don't mass hallucinate. Liars can't believe their own lie. And persecutors don't convert without a good reason. So the plausibility element is the hypothesis that accounts for all or most of those truths. That's likely to be the correct hypothesis. And so less ad hoc would be, or ad hoc, right? So when you're assuming things, it would be saying that we're relying on a hypothesis that assumes that crucifixion doesn't cause death, that people do mass hallucinate, and that people will, persecutors will convert for no good reason at all, right? So, which is not good, right? That's not going to help that's not something that's going to help your case. Yeah. So any questions on those two? Does that make sense? No, this one's, some of these are a little bit more dry than others. Yeah, and so like I said, so the skeptic theories rely on multiple assumptions, right? So, they rely on mass hallucinations, they rely on crucifixion being survivable and the disciples being liars. And that's why that they have a much less powerful argument than the supernatural resurrection, because it doesn't, the only assumption that a supernatural resurrection relies upon is the existence of God. That's really the only assumption that you have. The rest of them, our accounts really do make it so that it explains why the disciples had such a radical transformation. It explains why Paul had a radical transformation. It explains why James also, who was skeptical of his own brother. I mean, can you imagine calling your brother God? I mean, that's just something that goes against all of our intuitions. But in his case, and I think that probably was why why he was so skeptical of his brother. That's why he had to get over that. But when he saw the resurrected Christ, that was enough to convince him. So it really does give, it makes the case for Christ the case of the resurrection very compelling. How can Christians believe in miracles? Okay, so miracle, defined in this way, is an extraordinary event manifesting divine intervention in human affairs. So that's just kind of a simple definition. When we defend the truth miracles, we're actually defending why we believe in God, right? Because if God exists, then miracles are possible, right? So, but if we don't have God exist, then they're completely untenable. They're impossible. Which is why people kind of go to these other challenges, right? Which, as we've seen, don't really give as strong of an argument as the supernatural resurrection. But the reason they go to those lengths to use those natural explanations is because they will not accept that supernatural phenomena can occur, because their worldview, says that God doesn't exist, and if God doesn't exist, these miracles can't happen. So, Let's see. Is there something? Yeah, but we don't need to defend every truth claim. So the only miracle that determines the truth of Christianity, like I said earlier, is the resurrection itself. So don't feel like you have to go, explaining how Jesus walked on water, or how he calmed the storm, or how he cleaned the leper. Like all those things, are possible if he was resurrected from the dead, right? Because that's the seal of approval that he was God. Okay, does that make sense? Cool. So are miracles possible? If God exists, yes. If God does not exist, no. We already said that. The scientific view, or the prevailing scientific view, is that nature's laws are immutable, right? So they're fixed, they're unchanging, and that's where they get into this kind of a spot where they can't even consider, a supernatural thing happening, right? Because if nature's laws are immutable, then it's a closed system, right? You can't tap into that. Of course, that presumes that God doesn't exist. Someone who created the system that could then, intervene as he would like. And John Lennox says it this way. He says, God created an orderly universe with laws that allow us to recognize when they are broken. So, if a law is broken, we're going to recognize it because it doesn't go with the normal predictable way that the laws normally operate. And he says, unless you have evidence that the system is totally closed, you can't argue against the possibility of miracles. Really, the only way you can do that is to prove that God doesn't exist, which of course they can't do. So there's a circular thing going on with this too, though, which is that really what they're saying is that God doesn't exist because nature's laws are immutable. And then they go back the other way and they say nature's laws are immutable because God doesn't exist. And so you end up in this circular reasoning that just doesn't really explain how that nature's laws can be immutable, because they can't really prove that God doesn't exist. And the existence of predictable laws doesn't mean that they're fixed, right? Just because there's a pattern, right, where they almost never are changed, doesn't mean that they can't change, right? And we have biblical examples of that happening. And so the question is, why should we believe that? Why should we believe in biblical miracles, since most of us have never experienced one ourselves? Right, so a lot of people will kind of, put up the characterization that they'd happened all back then, right? So it kind of reads like folklore, right? When you're reading the Bible, it's not real because I haven't seen anyone part the sea, I haven't seen anyone raise anyone from the dead, and so it's just it's a fairy tale. But the thing is that what that's doing is it's not taking into account, well, do miracles have a purpose, or was God just doing them for fun back in biblical times and not now? And when you read the Bible closely, you see that it's honestly kind of flurries of miracles and then nothing for centuries. And then flurries of miracles and then nothing for centuries. And then with like little blips here and there. And I would actually argue, even today, you see miracles sometimes. Medically, I think, you'll see remission of cancer. Like, how do you explain that? And of course, the scientific community is, well, we just don't understand it yet. I'm like, well, you're never going to understand it if you don't allow for a supernatural worldview, because that may very well be what caused it. But in the Bible, we have three prominent periods of miracles in biblical history. One being the Exodus, right? So, and the main function of that, right? So God is delivering his people from bondage into the promised land, right? So into the land of Canaan, and he was making his presence known. He wanted them to know that it was him that was doing it, right? This is for his glory, and so he did the plagues, he did the parting of the Red Sea, he did, manna, manifesting, all those kinds of things to show that he was God, and he wanted his people to know that. And so then we have Elijah and Elisha, right? So we have, Elijah calling down the fire. We have, Elisha filling the jars of oil, and we have miracles going on at this time. Does anyone know what's kind of going on in Israel's history at this time? It's kind of it's a little bit more ambiguous. It's not like there's a major shift happening, even though there is something happening. Really what's going on this time is Israel straying really hard. They're worshiping the Baals and the Ashtoreths, and they're just, marrying with, pagan peoples, and obviously we're not following God in any significant way. And so God was trying to bring them back in, and the way that he could show that is through Elijah and Elisha. He was showing them miracles to bring them back. Of course, it didn't work, and they, were eventually deported to Babylon, but that's what was going on at that time. And then, of course, we have Jesus, right? So Jesus is the biggest moment in man's redemptive trajectory, right? Because that's finally when the 180 happens, and we can now be forgiven from sins. And so Jesus was making some pretty intense claims, right? Claiming to be God, claiming to be the Messiah, claiming to be equal with God, and all these things. And so in order for his message to be authenticated, what do you think he needs to do in order for people to believe him? miracles, right? So he needs to show that somehow. And so really what God is doing with these miracles throughout these times in history is there are ways for him to authenticate his messengers. It's how he authenticated Moses, it's how he authenticated Elijah and Elisha, and it's how he authenticated himself when he came in the form of Jesus, right? So, there's a function going on here with miracles, and although God does maybe still perform miracles today, there's not as much religious context for that as there was in these three prominent history periods. And it doesn't mean that we have examples of miracles happening outside of these three periods. I mean, we have the man in the fire, right, which happened in Babylon. So there are times when it happens, and there's these little blips of miracles, but in terms of when they happen in greater number, these are the three big times. So, but it's always because that there's a function and a reason. So when people say, well, why would you believe that God existed, that God was performing miracles back then and not now? Well, there was actually a religious reason for it back then. And I think that we will see it again one day. Christ is coming again, and I think we're going to see another flurry of miracles at that time. So, all right. As usual, I got you out at 9:05 or 10:05. So we can all head up. But yeah, thanks for coming, and hope you enjoyed that and found it interesting. So I will see you guys up there. All right, you're very welcome.